Welcome on behalf of Humanists Australia. My name's Akiva. I'm a member of Humanists Australia, and Lyndon asked if I would introduce him and moderate this evening. And apparently I said yes. So here we go. So tonight's talk, I'll let Lyndon introduce the topic himself, but just like to tell you a little bit about Lyndon's story, who's been involved in the Australian humanist movement for many years. Lyndon is a founding convener of the ACT Humanist Society. He's been president of the Council of Australian Humanist Societies, and in 2021 received an Outstanding Humanist Achiever Award from Humanists Australia, our hosts this evening. Lyndon has a PhD from Sydney University in political science, focusing on Mencius and international relations theory. And Lyndon is particularly interested in classical Chinese philosophy, especially the thought of Confucius and Mencius, which he believes contains some very relevant insights for contemporary humanism. Lyndon's interest in the overlap between the thought of Hume and Mencius led him to explore concepts like human heartedness, which focus on how, in the absence of religion and other external agencies, cultivating our human social potential can be a path to personal fulfillment and a strong approach to ethics and politics. Lyndon is keen to help establish an approach to life which is relevant today, leading to him focusing on exploring human heartedness and humanist thought as a way to address the issues of modernity. Lyndon, we are very privileged to have you talking to us tonight about human heartedness. The microphone is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Akiva. Thank you very much for that welcome. I'm going to start in a rather technological way by just setting up the screen sharing. Then I'm going to start.
Excellent. And just to mention why Lyndon's setting up, the idea was to have questions pretty much after Lyndon's presentation. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Akiva. Now, if you could just tell me if people can see.
That's good, Lyndon.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, I'll start the actual talk now. This is going to be the first in a series of planned talks exploring human heartedness. And it's fitting that this series starts with an analysis of modernity, the social system we all live in today. Modernity has generated unprecedented wealth and political freedoms. It's a social system in which we have the freedom to remake ourselves as whoever we want to be. It is, in that sense, probably the greatest emancipatory project in human history, but it's also flawed. It's undermined traditional forms of community and morality while failing to offer a clear alternative. Because of this, it often produces a sense of existential emptiness as people find themselves socially isolated and cut off from sources of meaning and community. Modernity's flaws can even trigger major wars as people are attracted by movements that offer community and meaning in return for challenging modernity. Having said that, our goal is not to reject modernity, but to reform it, to acknowledge its built-in flaws and explore human-hearted ways to address them. Human-heartedness is a general term for any approach to life which acknowledges our pro-social human capacities, such as our potential for compassion, love, and friendship, and sees cultivating and building on them as the key to developing meaning and fulfillment in life. Its core idea is that these pro-social potentials are part of our inherent potential as human beings, and they do not depend on external sources such as God, the nation, pure reason, or some other ideology. And human-heartedness is a humanist approach to life, which has been advocated by many thinkers in the past and has also been confirmed by contemporary science. It's capable of lighting a path through the issues of today's world so as to help find a better and more fulfilling life. I hope everyone here today experiences some of the positive benefits human-heartedness has to offer. But I need to start this talk at the beginning now. What is modernity and what are its problems? And this slide here is relevant to this part. In a nutshell, modernity is a descriptive term for the process carried out in the name of reason, of challenging tradition and religion while building societies focused on markets, democracy, human rights and well-being, and individual autonomy. The precise definition of modernity is contested, of course, and I'm not going to waste time arguing for any one particular definition. In essence, it's a descriptive term for an ongoing historical process, and that's how I'll be using the term. Modernity began in Europe and is now a global process, being more or less advanced in different parts of the world. Different cultures have made different compromises with it, modernity in Japan being slightly different to modernity in France, which is different to modernity in Australia, and so on. Some prefer terms like capitalism or global capitalism to signify the processes of modernity, and the market system is certainly a part of modernity, but modernity also includes a focus on reason and science and an ideology of hyper-individualism, which advocates for the maximum possible freedom of expression, freedom of sexual preferences and identity, and so on. It's a complex of factors in which market forces play a crucial role rather than just market forces. A good way to think about modernity as an ongoing process is to consider Zygmunt Bauman's distinction between solid and liquid modernity. In this slide, we can see simplified models of traditional society and of solid and liquid modernity. They are heuristics and can overlap with each other, but they're good for illustrating how the processes of modernity develop. The starting point, traditional society, should be self-explanatory. People are born into social roles such as peasant or aristocrat, which are determined by the status of the family they're born into. The overall social and governance system is justified not by reason or democracy, but by religion, tradition, inheritance, and so on. Moral codes that exist are enforced in God's name. From the European Enlightenment onwards, loosely speaking, the pressure of rational critique and economic changes sees traditional society, firstly in Europe and later around the world, begin to crumble and modernity starts to emerge. In the first version of modernity, solid modernity, the stable, solid structures of tradition were replaced by new structures that at first also appeared solid. The first and perhaps greatest change is that people's identity and status were no longer determined by the circumstances of their birth. People became free to develop whatever career most suits them, and more generally, to adopt a personalised sense of identity. This new freedom to be oneself is imperfectly realised, of course, but the extent of the change is still extraordinary. The easiest way to comprehend this is to consider the question, so often asked of children in modern society, what do you want to be when you grow up? It's a common question that almost everyone alive today has either asked or answered or both. But in traditional society, it was not a common question because it made no sense. The peasant's child would become a peasant, the aristocrat's an aristocrat, and so on. There was no choice in what they would become when they grew up. The second great change is that tradition and religion lose much of their social power and can no longer be used to legitimise governance systems. Instead, democracy and or some concept of public benefit, like economic growth, take over as the legitimising ideas. Simultaneously, new solid structures start to emerge. The education system expands to train everyone and qualifies people into jobs suitable for them. Those jobs or careers are often seen as lifelong stable identities. Theories like the three-class model of society, working, middle and upper take hold. People are seen as able to move across the class system, but it's seen as relatively solid itself, and mass political parties arise to represent the classes. In liquid modernity, perpetual critique starts to undermine even modernity's own structures. Lifelong stable careers start to disappear or become fluid, as do traditional family units and gender and sexual identities. Developing an identity becomes a more continuous task, as identity becomes more individualised and less based on joining an established social class. It therefore requires constant reassertion. The sociologist Anthony Giddens called this the project of the self, and he sees it as becoming a larger and larger project for people living in modernity. As identity becomes more important, the class-based political parties that develop during solid modernity start to lose touch, and there is an increase in identity politics and politicians crossing traditional party boundaries. The increasing fluidity of things also sees modernity's ideas of progress and shared human identity start to fade and be replaced by concepts like personal truths, post-truth, post-fact, and so on. In the field of ethics, market values and hyper-individualism start to overwhelm attempts to recreate a shared moral system. As modernity becomes more liquid, we see virtually all structures, including the seemingly solid structures of solid modernity, being challenged and subject to change and transformation. Modernity is the period of history we live in. The flaws of modernity create challenges and a series of crises which we need to address. So what are the flaws of modernity that we need to address? The first issue we will look at is the existential emptiness of modernity. By undermining belief in religion and tradition, modernity has also undermined the sense of meaning and community they offered, and it has not provided a convincing replacement. Instead, it leaves many people trapped in a world where market values override everything else, including meaning and community. This situation can leave people with a sense of social isolation and meaninglessness in life. The greater material wealth generated by modernity provides many benefits, and for those struggling with true poverty, it's crucial to living a better life. But for many people, material wealth on its own is not enough to replace the human need for a positive sense of social connection and a sense of meaning and purpose in life. This sense of emptiness, of being cut off from others and from a broader sense of meaning, has been reported by a wide range of observers from the earliest stages of modernity. The first great sociologist of modernity, Emile Durkheim, developed the concept of anomie to describe the sense of being cut off from a set of sustaining social norms and explored its impact. Many others have used different terms or concepts like disenchantment or social isolation to describe essentially the same thing: a sense of disconnection and lack of fulfillment coming with life in modernity. I'm using existential emptiness as a covering term to refer to all of these rather than trying to pick one precise theory in particular. Some people even point to an apparent increase in mental health concerns, like depression and anxiety, as an indicator of the stresses of modernity. It will be going too far to say that depression and anxiety are caused by modernity, but it's interesting that these and other mental health problems appear to increase with modernity. Of course, critics relying on religion and tradition also point out the existential emptiness of modernity. And they say the solution is easy: reject modernity and return to traditional values. We will not be looking at that solution. We will focus on addressing modernity's problems through building a more human-hearted modernity, not through a return to the past. But I note in passing that the reason many of these conservative critiques find an audience is the very fact of the existential emptiness of modernity. The constant output of self-help books, life coaches, New Age religions, rebranded religions, psychological self-help guides, the apparent need for more and more therapy, and so on that we see today are all signs of the existential emptiness of modernity and people's search to address it. Modernity's existential emptiness can also be exacerbated by some other achievements. In particular, issues related to identity. Modernity's greatest achievement, the freedom to develop a person's own identity, has also created new problems. For instance, there is now the possibility of failure to achieve an identity goal. People can spend their whole lives trying, and often failing, to create a specific identity, such as musician or writer or successful person. The resulting sense of failure is exacerbated by the knowledge that others have succeeded. As well, there is the problem of recognition of a person's newly developed identity. The more identity becomes untethered from a stable social system, the greater the effort necessary to win recognition of it. If an identity project only means joining an established identity, like a member of the middle classes, there is a clear measure of how to achieve recognition. But in the situation of a more fluid modernity, it becomes more difficult to achieve the recognition necessary to validate one's new sense of identity. Consider, for example, new Instagram and TikTok identities who require the constant affirmation of likes and views and are at risk of disappearing if the flow of views stops. It's interesting that the term identity crisis itself was only coined and became widespread during the 20th century. The difficulty many people find in achieving recognition of their identity also overlaps with the problem of existential emptiness. With the lack of an automatic sense of connection and community, recognition of a person's specific identity becomes more crucial, as it becomes the only path to feeling connected and recognised by a broader social group. In this way, asserting identity can become a solution to the problem of existential emptiness. However, this also means that, if it occurs, the feeling that one's identity is not receiving appropriate recognition becomes all the more devastating, as such recognition has become a path to addressing existential emptiness. No wonder that many modern societies are more and more fracturing along identity lines, and identity politics is moving to the fore. We need to acknowledge the challenges of identity in the contemporary world, and how these challenges are magnified by the existential emptiness of modernity. The third issue that I wanted to include under the main challenges facing modernity is the collapse of command morality. Traditional morality in the Christian West was justified as being the command of God. But once God has died, what can justify ethics? Many attempts have been made to develop purely rational arguments to justify moral behaviour. But pure reason can no more prove we should be ethical than it can prove we should be anything. The attempts to develop categorical imperatives and other commands of reason have been mostly unpersuasive and unsuccessful. Market values and hyper-individualism have stepped into the gap. The lack of a shared moral discourse contributes to people's sense of social isolation and emptiness. There is no shared moral language people can appeal to when they wish to criticise aspects of modernity. Instead, people wind up being separated into more and more disconnected groups within which, at least, there can be a shared moral discourse. A better approach to the collapse of command morality might be to abandon the quest for new commands and try to focus instead on what can help all humans and other creatures to flourish and to cultivate our pro-social potentials. But we'll discuss this more shortly. So I'll give running summaries throughout this talk so we don't get lost in the details. So this is my first little running summary. Modernity has contributed greatly to human progress, but its weaknesses, in particular its existential emptiness, identity crisis, and failed attempts to find a new source of command for ethics, leave many people feeling adrift and unfulfilled by life in modernity. But of course, modernity does offer some broad general models for living. Unfortunately, they can't successfully address existential emptiness. I'm going to look at two very briefly. Pure rationalism, meaning in this context, I'm using that to mean a life lived in accord with reason, and homo economicus, the idea that human nature is entirely about wealth acquisition. So let's go on to reason. Reason is crucial to modernity, and we don't want to lose the many benefits that come from applying a rational analysis to life's problems. But to the extent that the use of reason has sometimes morphed into a specific ideology, which I'll call rationalism, that the best life is the life lived purely in accord with reason, it has created a trap which exacerbates existential emptiness. While we are capable of reason, we are not purely rational creatures, as many have observed, from the Romantics who led the revolt against rationalism in the 19th century, through Nietzsche and Freud, to contemporary scientific researchers who have described the role of emotions in decision-making and shown that human beings are neither driven by nor made happy by reason alone. Some very readable examples of contemporary scientific writers who've explored the extra-rational aspects of human beings include Antonio Damasio and Daniel Kahneman. Damasio, a leading neurologist, has written a series of books exploring the role of emotions in our thinking and decision-making. See, for instance, his book Descartes' Error, which explores the fundamental role of emotions in brain functions and human reason. More recently, the bestseller Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman summarises many of the mental shortcuts and heuristic rules of thumb we often use rather than always thinking things through rationally. It's not a challenge to science to note that we are not purely rational creatures. The fall of the idea of humans as purely rational beings is driven by science itself. The vision of a world where we all live in accord with reason is one which cannot be realised. Too often, attempting to justify policies in the name of reason alone risk losing sight of the very humanity we need to respect in policy making and in daily life. Now, let's look at Homo economicus. Today's most socially influential, rationalist-inspired ideology is free market theory, which assumes that we are all members of the species Homo economicus, rational agents, each of whose goal is maximising individual economic self-interest. This model has underpinned economic growth, but by prioritising material wealth over all other concerns, such as social connection and meaning, it has also trapped many people in unfulfilling lives in which more and more money does not increase meaning and fulfillment. And of course, to those who don't succeed financially, it has offered only poverty and a sense of failure. It is very clear that we are social creatures and positive social connection are keys to happiness and fulfillment. While a basic level of material wealth is absolutely necessary for people's happiness and fulfillment, creating a culture where nothing but material wealth is seen as the answer creates a culture which cannot succeed. The narrowness of the Homo economicus vision helps explain why we have the phenomenon of societies becoming wealthier and wealthier, but people being no happier nor more fulfilled. By itself, economic growth cannot successfully address the existential emptiness of modernity. The Homo economicus model creates other problems too. It contributes to increasing inequality and economic precarity, which in turn increases people's sense of insecurity. It also contributes to environmental damage and climate change by prioritising economic growth over all other concern. It helps create the sense of social isolation where people feel they are alone and helpless, facing a giant economic machine with no access to a concept of community or values to stand against it. In this way, it can even magnify the problems of modernity. So to continue with my running summaries, existential emptiness and the related problems we have discussed cannot be effectively addressed by the models of rationalism and Homo economicus that we've looked at. Modernity's existential emptiness occurs in the context of the unsociable world of market values and of the purely rational life, the world of the market and of the algorithm. A relentless focus only on economic growth will not be able to address existential emptiness and suggests modernity in its current form may be self-defeating as a path to happiness and fulfillment for all. Now, you may be thinking, so what? Nothing is perfect. These are minor issues. Why do modernity's problems matter? There's two crucial reasons to be concerned about them. The first reason is that the existential emptiness of modernity and the resulting existence of so many unhappy and unfulfilled people is a genuine issue in its own right. This contributes to both the phenomenon of rising rates of mental health issues as societies modernise and the continuing phenomenon of people achieving higher incomes yet remaining unhappy and unfulfilled. It's not necessary for so many people to live lives marked by a sense of social isolation and insecurity. The second reason comes from the alarming fact that some of the ideological options people use to address existential emptiness create a danger of exploitation, persecution, and warfare. One of the most common ways people address existential emptiness, whether consciously or unconsciously, is to seek some form of association with something that seems higher and more long-lasting than our fragile individual humanity. There are many options to choose from in doing this, from feeling connected with a sporting team to a favourite celebrity. But the existential emptiness of modernity also leaves the door open for ideologies from outside modernity. Ideologies like hypernationalism, revived religion, fascism and strongman worship to step in and offer a highly risky trade-off as a solution. These ideologies offer a sense of community and meaning to people in return for rejecting all or part of modernity's program. The problem is that these ideologies set up something to be higher than our common humanity, whether it is the nation, a god, the great leader, or something else. The interests of that higher thing are expressed as greater than the dignity of an individual human being and must be put ahead of individual human dignity. Thus, the interests of the so-called higher entity can be used to justify discrimination and persecution of anything perceived as a threat to it. They can also be used to justify warfare against anything perceived as a threat to the interests of the supposed higher entity. We have actually seen major wars. For instance, the challenge of fascism in World War II and the challenge of Islamic fundamentalism, which fit into the framework of an attack on modernity's universalism on behalf of nationalist or religious idols. Even today, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with its invocation of essentialist theories of Russian nationalism, rejection of gay and other non-traditional identities, and alleged trigger of Ukraine joining the wider and modern world, can be seen in this light. Putin turning to a hyper-nationalist ideology to legitimize his rule, and rejecting various aspects of modernity's political and social system. At a lesser level, we see this phenomenon in social movements like Brexit and Making America Great Again, where people feeling left out by modernity can reject its universalist aspects and shelter behind the idol of the national identity. It's tempting to say that these sorts of challenges to modernity are the consequences of intellectual errors and people who are somehow mistaken, and that's all there is to it. But what makes all these developments possible is the existential emptiness of modernity. It leaves too many people feeling isolated, unconnected, and bereft of meaning. This is the perpetual crisis of modernity, its failure to offer a path to meaning and fulfillment that respects human sociality. As long as it does not do this, we can expect both a continuation of existential emptiness and a continuation of the appeal of new and old social movements that challenge modernity. Now, another provisional summary. If we do nothing to address the problems of modernity, the problem of its existential emptiness continues. This needs addressing in its own right, and because solutions from outside modernity, like revived religion and hyper-nationalism, create a continual risk of persecution and warfare. This is modernity's built-in crisis, which gives this talk its title, The Crisis of Modernity. There is, however, a way to address these problems, an approach which is supported both by contemporary science and many thinkers of the past. It's an approach which is consistent with retaining many of the benefits of modernity rather than rejecting it. That approach is, of course, human-heartedness. The best approach to the crisis of modernity is to build a human-hearted modernity. So what is human-heartedness? Here's a very short definition. Human-heartedness is a general term for any approach to life which acknowledges our pro-social human capacities, such as our potential for compassion, love, and friendship, and sees cultivating and building on them as the key to developing meaning and fulfillment in life. The core idea of human-heartedness is that these pro-social potentials are part of our inherent potential as social beings. They do not depend on external sources such as God, the nation, pure reason, or some other ideology. Human-heartedness also offers an approach and a path, I should say, to happiness and fulfillment in life. A human-hearted approach to life focuses on cultivating our social potential and building positive relationships with others. While this is not all that is necessary for a good life, it is the best platform for a fulfilling life. Living life in a more human-hearted way is the best antidote to the existential emptiness of modernity. Human-heartedness is a practice as much as it is a set of ideas and observations. Through practicing a more human-hearted approach to life, a person can develop a more positive set of social relationships and live a happier and more fulfilled life compared to a life based on economic competition. At the personal level, it can offer a way to move from existential emptiness to a more fulfilled life based on positive social connection. Human-heartedness also supplies a foundation, being our sense of empathy and sympathy for others, to which we can apply reason and evidence to develop guidelines for ethics and politics. At the macro level, it can underpin a vision of a world based on respect for the basic dignity and flourishing of all, a world in which people focus on trying to develop their best selves. In other words, a foundation for a global vision of politics and ethics. Now, a brief diversion onto the name. Why call this approach human-hearted? Basically because such pro-social qualities as sympathy, compassion, and love come from our human capacities, not from anywhere else. And of course, we're using the word human, the word heart, metaphorically, as in have a heart or she is kind-hearted. It's an English language usage of the word, which has been quite common for some time. And on that note, this talk is the first, as I mentioned before, in a series that Humanist Australia will be promoting that explores the building of a more human-hearted modernity. To set the scene, we need to look at the problems of modernity, so this talk focused mostly on the problems of modernity, the situation we face today. Future talks will explore a range of human-hearted approaches and solutions to the issues of today's world. Nonetheless, I would still like to spend a few minutes outlining some of the evidence behind human-heartedness and look at some ways human-heartedness can help us envision a different way of life and a better future. First, let's look at some human-hearted thought from the past. Just to contextualize a bit, I picked two people, Mencius, a famous Chinese philosopher who already got mentioned in Akiva's kind introduction of me, and Charles Darwin. I'll start with Mencius. This is a quote from him. Here is why I say that all human beings have a mind that commiserates with others. Now, if anyone was suddenly to see a child about to fall into a well, his mind would always be filled with alarm, distress, pity, and compassion. That he would react accordingly is not because he would use the opportunity to ingratiate himself with the child's parents, nor because he would seek commendation from neighbours and friends, nor because he would hate the adverse reputation. From this, it may be seen that one who lacks a mind that feels pity and compassion would not be human. The mind's feeling of pity and compassion is the beginning of humaneness. So I'll just note that he's already asserting a completely human heart. Sorry, I'm getting a bit of interference here.
Yeah, just try again. If anybody who's not on mute wouldn't mind muting themselves, thank you.
I've just muted the source of that noise.
Thanks, Marianne. So I'll just summarise that here, more than 2,000 years ago, he's already outlining a completely human-hearted position. It's sourced in our humanity. It doesn't require any god or superhuman or command of reason or command of the emperor. It's sourced in our humanity, and he's trying to use arguments to justify it, pointing to that first moment of shock when you see the child fall in the well. As he notes later on, you might think of more practical reasons, but at that very first moment of shock, you get that impulse. So that was Mencius' articulation of a human-hearted position more than 2,000 years ago. Now, if we go to Charles Darwin, writing in his book, The Descent of Man, which was basically about the evolution of human beings, any animal, whatever endowed with well-marked social instincts, would inevitably acquire a moral sense or conscience as soon as its intellectual powers had become as well developed or nearly as well developed as man. As man advances in civilization and small tribes are united into larger communities, the simplest reason would tell each individual that he ought to extend his social instincts and sympathies to all the members of the same nation, though personally unknown to him. This point being once reached, there is only an artificial barrier to prevent his sympathies extending to men of all nations and races. Darwin calls it the social instinct, but it's the same thing. He's saying that it's built into us, that we have this capacity for empathy and sympathy for others. He's also saying there we can use reason to build onto that and develop general principles. And of course, it's not so much in this quote, but he's saying evolution favoured selection for creatures, meaning us, with those sorts of capacities. So, and I could go on, but I'm not going to because it'll drag this talk out too much. But many eminent thinkers from many different cultures and periods of history have articulated human-hearted points of view. Now, recent scientific research has also tended to strongly support a human-hearted analysis. As I've already mentioned, it's well established now that we're not purely rational beings and that our feelings and emotions play a crucial role in our thinking and in our happiness. In the area of evolution, there is more and more evidence that we have evolved as a social species, with cooperation being selected for and playing a key role. As William von Kippel writes in The Social Leap, nothing is more important to us than our social connections, because nothing was more critical for our ancestors' survival and reproduction. In the area of neuroscience, there is now plentiful research showing how a sense of close connection or bonding with another can trigger the release of feel-good chemicals like oxytocin in the body. In the arena of psychology, the Harvard study of adult development, also known as the Harvard Longevity Study, is probably the most famous longitudinal study of how people's lives turn out. Beginning in the 1930s, it followed the lives of more than 700 male youths. Well, they were youths when the project started. A lot of them have obviously become very old or died. It has now been going for more than 80 years. The Waldinger and Schultz book listed on the slide below, that's the second from the bottom there, Robert Waldinger and Mark Schultz, reports on this study. It's the most recent report. It's, I think, 2023, that book. And there's a quote from this book that I've got here. Through all the years of studying these lives, one crucial factor stands out for the consistency and power of its ties to physical health, mental health, and longevity. Contrary to what many people might think, it's not career achievement or exercise or a healthy diet. Don't get us wrong, these things matter a lot, but one thing continuously demonstrates its broad and enduring importance: good relationships. In fact, good relationships are significant enough that if we had to take all 84 years of the Harvard study and boil it down to a single principle for living, one life investment that is supported by similar findings across a wide variety of other studies, it would be this: good relationships keep us healthier and happier, period. Period being American for full stop. In other words, they're saying positive social connections and relations with others is more important than anything else for a fulfilling life. And this has emerged from a study which has been going for more than 80 years now. Down the bottom of that slide, I've listed a number of the books that I've referred to in this presentation. I'm not going to go through them all. There's umpteen books in umpteen different fields reporting on research from which backs up a human-hearted view of human beings. But I've just listed a few there to have that in the background in case I ever do a longer presentation where I really go through all the evidence. But I hope I've provided enough to establish the general point. And so I would say the basic insights of human-heartedness, our social nature, and the role of positive social connections in leading to a happy and fulfilling life are well established. Human-heartedness moves from insights about human sociality to a framework for addressing issues when we apply some analysis. Here are 5 key principles I've extracted from various writings on human-heartedness, which I think can characterise a human-hearted approach to living in modernity. The first 2 we've effectively talked about quite a bit already. Number 1, humans are social creatures. We are a social species with a biological capacity to connect with others and treat them with kindness and compassion. Our sociality has been a key influence in our evolution, enabling us to cooperate effectively in groups, including through families and larger social formations. Of course, we are not solely pro-social creatures. We are also selfish and competitive and so on. But modernity's underlying vision of human nature, that we are rational, material, self-advantage, calculating machines with a focus on relentless individual competition, is quite simply wrong. Second principle, fulfillment comes in significant part from realising our social potentials. It's clear that building positive social relations with others through behaviour based on realising pro-social potentials such as sympathy, friendship and love is a surer path to fulfilment than competitive individualism. This is not to say we don't have distinctive individual characteristics. We do, and developing them is part of developing a happy and meaningful life. But our individuality is better developed as much as possible in a positive social context rather than a purely competitive one. Building on our positive social potentials is also connected to the need many people feel to be part of something greater as part of their search for fulfillment and meaning in life. This can be a risky undertaking when the something greater is seen as an extra human entity like a god. In practice, though, it is by realising our best social potentials that we build larger community associations, family, clubs, and other social groups. By self-awarely realising our social potential, we can create our own greater entities to associate with without ever losing sight of the fact that these entities are based on our shared humanity. A third principle there, self-realisation or actualisation. I'm going to use the term actualisation. Self-actualisation is a social rather than an individualistic project. A human-hearted approach does not require rejecting the goal of self-actualisation. This is a goal that has often been associated with modernity and its hyper-individualism. What a human-hearted outlook does, however, is transform self-actualisation from an individualistic project into a social project. Human-hearted self-actualisation involves realising our social potential by building pro-social relations with others. Of course, there are individual aspects to our personalities as well, but a human-hearted approach to self-actualisation involves developing those more individualised aspects on a platform of positive social connections rather than giving an absolute priority to those individualised aspects. Principle 4, ethics based on flourishing rather than perfect rules or commands. A human-hearted approach to ethics abandons the quest for a new source of commands and instead asks what, on the basis of the evidence we have, is most likely to promote flourishing. Human-heartedness relies on the empirical evidence that we do have a potential for sympathy and care for others, and that we do indeed develop a greater sense of happiness and fulfillment when we develop relationships based on treating others well. These provide the basis for an approach to ethics driven by sympathy and compassion that support flourishing for all. This human-hearted foundation for ethics does not rely on the commands of God or of reason, but on the cultivation and development of our human potential. In this way, it can be a help in daily life as we seek to develop the best in ourselves and support the best in others as we meet them. Principle 5, living with uncertainty. Modernity has undermined the traditional social certainties of religion and tradition. Unfortunately, many people still hanker after certainty and erect new ideologies, from market values to nationalism to social Darwinism and so on, in an attempt to develop new certainties. Human-heartedness does not offer a new certainty. It does say we can live better lives if we develop and cultivate our social potentials, but it does not say we must do so or that we inevitably will. Instead, it offers awareness of the marvellous human tools we have to negotiate life. If we open ourselves to the possibilities inherent in our own social potentials, we can develop more fulfilling lives for ourselves as individuals and more easily work together to build a better world for all. Instead of an endless search for external idols and new certainties, we need to be courageous enough to accept that we live with uncertainty and in the social world and make the best of what we do have, our human-heartedness, our human potential. Practicing human-heartedness is a great aid in doing this. Now, if we apply these principles to all sorts of questions, we can find them very helpful. But I think I want to save most of that for subsequent talks in this series. But what I put up here is just some very brief indications of how we can apply these principles in some parts of life. So think of this as a taster more than a comprehensive statement. If we look at daily life, building positive, supportive relations with others in ways that supports the best in them is better than competitive individualism in relating to other people. In relation to ethics, I've already talked about ethics as flourishing. Ethics could be a part of daily actions as people support their own and others' best potential. Sympathy and compassion can also drive a process of eventually extending recognition and dignity to all life forms, and reason can be used to develop guidelines building on sympathy and compassion, and so on. Identity. Now, we've talked a bit about identity. It's a positive part of modernity. Human-heartedness respects that we all share a common human identity. In fact, we all share multiple identities: human being, father or mother, employee, employer, and so on. A human-hearted approach respects these multiple identities, but does not allow them to override recognition of our shared human identity. Overcoming existential emptiness. Human-heartedness focus on positive sociality, a social form of self-actualization, and flourishing generally offers the basis of an antidote to existential emptiness, as I've discussed throughout this talk. Very briefly, some other taster points in relation to climate change. As a more human-hearted modernity would be less focused on perpetual economic growth, it would be easier for it to be consistent with policies designed to address environmental damage and climate change. As well, human-heartedness focuses on building a more united human political community would help create the type of political community needed to address global issues. And I've put that, maybe that's just repeating the point under global politics generally, that a human-hearted approach would be more globalist than nationalist due to its respect for our common humanity. It would be about beginning the move from national political systems to a human political system. Likewise, if we move beyond humans, human-heartedness's sympathy and compassion can eventually extend to the flourishing of non-human creatures. Sympathy and compassion can be a bridge, not only to understanding our fellow humans, but to understanding our fellow living beings. So in conclusion, I would like to say that human-heartedness addresses the problems of modernity by providing a path to fulfillment and happiness that addresses existential emptiness, and by providing an alternative framework for approaching the problems of ethics, identity, and politics that modernity creates. This is a framework based on the flourishing of our human sociality, not on an imaginary idol or some attempt to place a god or ideology above humanity. Humanism is often presented in the context of a critique of religion, but if all we do is critique religion, we continue to keep the door open for the problems of modernity that we have looked at today. Humanism, through human-heartedness, has something to offer people grappling with the problems of today's world. It can offer a path to living a more fulfilling life at the individual level and to building better community and policies for the future. So I'm saying through human-heartedness, humanism is an approach which can be applied to problems we face in today's world. And in that respect, Humanist Australia has established the Sydney Metro Humanist Community, which has been founded on the principle of human-hearted connection and compassion. Anyone living in Sydney is welcome to become involved. If you live elsewhere, please consider starting a human-hearted influenced community in your area, whether working with Humanist Australia or in some other way. I ask people here today to consider becoming part of building a more human-hearted modernity, whether through individual practices of human-heartedness or joining a human-hearted community. Together, we can build a more human-hearted modernity and have more fulfilling lives in doing so. And thank you for listening to me this evening, or whatever time zone you're in, depending on where you are. Thanks. I'll now unscreen share.
Thank you so much, Lyndon. I'm sure everybody would like to join me in thanking you for A truly inspiring talk with great historical breadth and full of depth as to how genuinely to explore human potential and to realize, the antidote to existential emptiness ourselves individually, but also collectively, which is where organizations like Humanists Australia and each of us present have such an important role to play. So
Yes.
thank you so much, Lyndon.
Thank you. Thanks.